But before I start, I'd like to see if you'll perhaps do a little work for me. I'd like to do a little experiment on you, actually two of them. And it's completely voluntary, and it's completely anonymous. So if you do take part, don't worry about how you do. And to do that, I need to divide the audience into two groups which are approximately equal. So I guess the simplest thing is if you're on this side, we'll call you group one. And if you're on this side of, say, the camera, we'll call you group two, even though it's not. Maybe you three gentlemen who are kind of on the border, can you be in group one? Make it a little more even, okay? It's not too scientific, so. So it's important that you don't speak during this, and you'll see why later. And so to start, you guys were group two. Could you please turn away from the screen so if you want to participate so that you don't see the screen for now? And we're going to have group one look at the screen. Okay, group one, please read this to yourselves and answer the question. You should have paper and a pen in front of you. Sorry. Hopefully everybody has paper and pen, and just write down your answer. Okay, you have that written down? You're going to turn this in a few minutes. All right? Okay, I'll just wait till. Okay, you all have that answer down? All right, now please read this question and write your answer to this. Okay, get that down? Okay, now group one, please turn away from the screen. And group two, please turn back and look at the screen, and you have your pencil and paper in front of you. Okay, please read this question and write down your answer. Okay, now please read this question and write down your answer. Okay, everyone get it down? All right, and now everyone can look forward again. Thank you for that one. And then one more little test. Okay, please, everyone study these words. I'll read them to you. And it doesn't matter whether you answer the questions that follow in English or German. Candy, sour, sugar, bitter, good, taste, tooth, nice, honey, soda, chocolate, heart, cake, eat, pie. All right? Now, is there another test coming? Yes, there is. But this isn't the test, so don't write anything now. I just want you to think back to the list. Think about all the words you can recall seeing or that I heard me say or you heard the translator say. Okay? Take just a second. Don't write anything now, though. Okay? Now, here's 3 words, and none of these words may have been on the list, or it may be that one of them, 2 of them, or that all 3 of them were on the list. I won't tell you which, but if you recognize any of these words from the list, I'd like you to write it down. But don't write it down unless you're confident that it was on the list. So if you can picture in your head that list, and you can picture that word, or you can remember me saying it or the translator saying the word, and you have a very clear memory of that, then write it down. Don't just guess, okay? So either none of these or all 3 or 1 or 2 of them were on the list. Okay? It's a good test for after lunch, huh? Okay. Some people are still writing. I'll give you another 30 seconds. Okay. So now at the top, if you're in group 1, put a 1 and circle it, and if you're in group 2, put a 2 and circle it, so that in case we get these mixed up, and then take your sheet of paper or tear it off your book, and they'll be collected. Now, can you collect group 1 and group 2? Okay. All right. Well, I'll just continue while the last of these are being collected. So I'm going to talk today about how your unconscious mind affects your behavior in ways that you're not aware of, but that have a great effect on the way you think and the way you act and the way you judge other people in particular. Let me start by defining what I mean by the unconscious. Okay, the unconscious, by unconscious, I mean processes that happen in your brain that are automatic, that you don't have to will to have happen, that you're not aware are even happening, and that you generally have no control over. So as we go through the talk, I'll give you many examples of this, and where I want to focus is on our social behavior, but I'm going to start in a somewhat simpler context and talk about our actual visual and audio perception, and then I'll go on to our social behavior. And you'll see that the unconscious mind is really a gift from evolution that helps us to get around in the world smoothly without awkwardness and difficulty. And without it, we wouldn't have survived as a species. It's a gift that allows us to see the world, to hear the world, and to immediately know what's going on, or to have a good picture, a good enough picture of what's going on that we can survive. But also it does the same thing in our social world, because human beings are a very social species, and our social interaction is very important for our species. And so our brain also has unconscious processes that go on that are automatically, that allow us to interact socially in a very smooth way. And since we don't understand what's influencing us, we often don't understand why we're behaving in certain ways, and we can't avoid behaving that way. Finally, about the unconscious, I want to make it clear that the unconscious that I'm talking about today is not the Freudian unconscious. This is a new unconscious concept of the unconscious that science has developed in roughly the last 20 years. So the Freudian unconscious was something that was hidden from us for motivational reasons, and that could be revealed through introspection and through therapy. This unconscious that I'm talking about is an unconscious that scientists have discovered that is inaccessible to our conscious mind because of the structure of the brain. So it's inherently not accessible to us. And the work that I'm going to talk about today is from a new field called social neuroscience. And social neuroscience is a combination really of three fields that got married together, or made a menage a trois, I guess you would say, around the year 2000. So it's a very recent field. And it's a combination of the field of social psychology, which is the study of how people interact with each other, and cognitive psychology, which is the psychology of how we think. Together, tied together by this field that I've represented in the center, which is neuroscience. And neuroscience is in some ways it's an old field, but really it's in most respects it's a new field that has exploded since the 1990s. And the reason for that is a new technology that's called functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI. fMRI is a lot like the regular MRI that your doctor does to look at your tendons or your kidneys or other parts of your body, but the additional aspect of fMRI, which is what the F relates to, is that when we do it on the brain, they can actually, researchers can actually see what part of your brain is functioning at a given moment. And because of that, it caused a revolution in psychology, where psychology used to be considered a soft science, where you observe people's behaviors and you make theories about what's going on, but they were somewhat, at least to a physicist, we would consider them somewhat vague theories. And these theories of psychology have been kicked up another level in terms of precision by the introduction of the fMRI, which allows us to connect the behavior or what people are thinking and feeling to the parts of their brain that are operating, and to learn what parts of the brain cause what kind of sensations in humans, and to start to piece together how the brain works. And I want to illustrate that just before we start briefly with the power of fMRI with this study here, which was done at Berkeley. Researchers took hundreds of subjects into the lab and put them in an fMRI machine with goggles on and had them look at a series of photographs. And here's just an example of 4 of the photographs. And they took an fMRI of these subjects' brain while they were staring at the photographs, and then based purely on this electromagnetic data of the functioning of the brain, they asked the computer to reconstruct what the photograph was. So the computer was given no information about the actual image that was being shown, but just about what the person was thinking. And I'll show you now how close the computer got. And I think it's strikingly close, not just in composition, but in theme. So this just gives you one example of the power of the fMRI that neuroscientists are applying now to understand how human beings think. The rest of the talk I'm going to divide into 2 sections. So first, as I mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about the unconscious in our physical perception and vision and in hearing. And I'm going to do that because it's a good way to illustrate the unconscious processes that go on, and it's also very dramatic. But also, I wouldn't go there except that the same processes that function in vision and in hearing are analogous processes that function in our social perception. And so I'll show you how the kind of things that go on to allow you to see and hear the world and interact smoothly with the physical world are also at work in your perception of the social world. And what I want you to take away from this is that your perception, your hearing, your vision, and your memory of events, as well as your social judgments, are not based on reality, but they're based on a mixture of data that comes from reality and also a lot of processing that's going on behind the scenes in your brain, in which that data is put together and filled in using things like context, your prior beliefs, and even your desires. So it's not an unbiased picture that you get of the world. So let me start with a very basic illustration of your vision. When you look out at the world, what you see is a clear picture of what you think is reality. Now, you know, of course, that the data that hits your retina is 2-dimensional, but what you perceive is 3-dimensional. So that's one way in which your mind does a calculation to create reality for you. But it actually goes far beyond that. What your retina actually receives is nothing like the clear image that you think you see. Here's an example of a picture that was taken on the side of a road, and it's a fairly clear picture over the whole image. But when you look at a picture like this, when you look at an image of the road, what the data that your retina actually picks up is not clear like this at all. Let me show you now the picture of literally the optical data that your retina would pick up when you looked at this image in the road. It's this very fuzzy picture here. It's only clear, this yellow dot was added to show where the eye was fixating, so that's the fixation point, and so it's there just to represent that. But you'll see that only in a small area around that is the picture clear. And also that there's a blind spot here that you're aware of, which is caused by where the optic nerve attaches to the retina. And your mind takes the data from both eyes that looks something like this and makes you think you're seeing something like that. So this is, as you can tell, this is a great gift to us, because if you're driving a car and you see this and you have to figure out what it means, you're probably going to crash. But instead, you immediately, without any effort and without any knowledge that it's going on, you perceive this instead. So that's a good example of how unconscious processing works. Your brain fills in missing data. Let me show you a specific illustration of some of these points. This figure illustrates how you use context and also how you have no control over what's going on. What you see on the screen is a checkerboard with a cylinder on it and a light source over here. And you see that the cylinder is casting a shadow, and you see there's white squares and black squares, and there's a square labeled B, which is a white square, and a square labeled A, which is a black square. Well, I'm going to tell you right now that the square labeled B is exactly the same as the square labeled A. Okay, so if your mind took in the raw data, it would see this square and that square as identical, and you would have to do some calculations to figure out that this is a white square, and it's identical to the black square because the shadow is cutting down the light. And you would take into account the surrounding squares and the shadow, and you do a big calculation. You'd finally go, oh, I know what it is. It's a checkerboard. That's a white square. That's a black square. There's a shadow, etc. But really, you don't have to do all that, because when you look at it, you automatically see it that way. So the first test I want to give you is look there and try and override your unconscious, okay, and take control of your mind, and I want you to concentrate on it until you see, if you can, the A and the B as being identical. So I think you can't do it, okay, because it's something that's done in your unconscious, and you automatically see it that way, and it's done automatically, and you have no willful control over it. But maybe you think I'm kidding you, and it's not really true. So let me take away the context now. I'm going to slide away the checkerboard, and look what happens to the A and the B. So now that they're not in the old former surroundings, you can see that the A and the B square are really the same. And they only look different because of the context that they were in. Here you see someone you probably recognize. He's an important person in the United States. And you see him upside down in two pictures. Now, I said that the social interactions are very important for people. And because of that, we have a part of our brain that focuses on faces. So if you look at two buildings, you can tell the buildings apart. You can identify one building or another building. You can look at monkeys or dogs, and you have some ability to tell them apart. But you have a much greater ability to look at people's faces and tell them apart, and even to tell what their emotions are. Because as we were evolving, these interactions, these alliances that people form, just as were very important, just as they were in other primates. And so we have special parts of our brain that are dedicated to the human face. The thing is that we didn't evolve looking at people upside down. And so that part of the brain doesn't really kick in when we see upside down faces. And this illustrates that point. So these two pictures probably both look pretty much like President Obama. But look what happens when I turn them over. So you can see that the one on your right is a horribly deformed picture of President Obama, and the other one is a normal picture of the president. But when it was upside down, they looked pretty much the same. I'll flip them over again for you. So when they flip over and they're right side up, that part of your brain that's dedicated to faces kicks in and it gives you all this information, and you're not even aware that all this is going on. So I've shown you a couple examples in vision. Let me show you one from hearing, just so you can see how this same processes operate in other modalities. I'm going to, again, the point of this little part of the talk is that your hearing is also not a direct reflection of the data that you take in. It's a construction that your mind creates of the outside world. I'm going to play you a song by a group called Led Zeppelin, which was famous, it still is famous, at least in the U.S. and England. And let me play you one of their classic songs called Stairway to Heaven. So I imagine that most of you understand English, but even if you do, it's hard to figure out what they're saying here, and same for me. But this is the song that they wrote, and I'm going to play it for you now backwards. And the question is, number one, did Led Zeppelin write a song that has meaning both forward and backwards? And were they smart enough to write a song that could have that meaning when you play it forward, but also have a meaning when you play it backwards? So listen to this and see if this makes sense to you. I wonder what the translators did with that one. Well, I'm guessing this sounded like gibberish to you. It certainly sounded like gibberish when I first heard it. But let me play it for you again now. But I'm going to give your unconscious mind a little help. I'm going to put the words on the screen. I'm going to put some words on the screen. And so watch the words. Actually, let me read the words for you first, because I know that for some of you whose English isn't so good, it might be better. Oh, here's to my sweet Satan, the one whose little path would make me sad, whose power is Satan. He'll give you 666. There was a little tool shed where he made us suffer, sad Satan. Okay, so now this is like the checkerboard that made the squares look different. I'm going to give you this context. Watch the words, listen, and see if you don't hear these words this time. So did you hear it? So this time you heard those words, and the last time it sounded like gibberish. So the question is, what is reality? Are the words really there, or is it gibberish? And the answer is, well, your mind is creating a reality. And when you have the context there, your unconscious mind makes it so that you can't help but hear this. It's fitting it in and making sense of these words the best it can. So just to show you again how you can't control this, I'm going to play it again for you, and I'd like you to watch the words while you listen, but hear the gibberish, override this unconscious. And I'm telling you that the words really aren't there. I just put these in because they are approximations to the gibberish, but now that you have this, you can't avoid it. So let's do it again and follow along, but don't hear these words. So now, just like the squares that you couldn't see as being the same as being the same, you could only see them as being different. Here, once you have the word, you can't avoid hearing it. So once you have a context, you'll see this as we get to the social situations. The same thing happens. You know, you can look at somebody and you judge them in a certain way based on a certain context or a certain first impression you had or certain things you heard about the person. And it's very hard to get past those impressions, just like it's very hard to get past hearing these words when you see them here. By now, I think you've been spoiled at this. So if I play this without the words, I'm just going to play the beginning. Oh, here's to my sweet Satan, the one whose little path, da da da. I'm going to play it without the words. You're still going to hear it. So now, what was gibberish before, you can't help hearing as these words. So this is, again, characteristic of all the processes, unconscious processes that happen as you construct the world around you. They're automatic. You have no awareness of them and no control over them. So let's now move on to social behavior. And I want to show you how our social perception is also not a direct result of the data we take in about people or about business affairs, or about politics, but it's a combination of data that we take in and context and our beliefs and even our desires for what we want to be true. Since we just had an election year in the States, I like to talk about elections. It's a very interesting context for this discussion. The question is, when you take in data about political candidates, do you judge them by their beliefs and their background, or you judge them by other data that you're not aware of using? And one of the things that humans do is they judge other people by appearance. And that's a very important way that we judge other people. And it's something that we may be consciously aware of to some extent, but most people would deny that it's something that affects them a great deal. In this experiment, researchers in California gathered first hundreds of subjects in the lab and showed them dozens of pictures of women and asked them to judge whether the women looked competent or incompetent. And from this study, they gathered together certain data on what makes a woman look competent versus incompetent. Some of the data that they gathered that showed competence were almond-shaped eyes and a slight widow's peak and a little smile. And they took notes on all this. Then they dismissed all those people, and they brought a few hundred more subjects into the lab. And these subjects were told that they were going to see pairs of flyers showing political candidates in a congressional race that was out of town somewhere that they weren't aware of. And they were told that the study was to investigate how people judge candidates when they don't see any advertising or hear any outside information, but purely see the same information on both candidates. And so they gave all the subjects 2 sheets of paper, one sheet representing each candidate. One was a Democratic candidate and one was from the other party, the Republicans. And each sheet showed the person's background and their beliefs and also had a picture of them on it. And the researchers had arranged these pictures to come in 2 types of pairs. Half of the subjects saw flyers in which the Democratic person was made, based on the studies that they had done earlier, to look as competent as possible, and the Republican was made to look less competent. And the other half of the people saw pairs of flyers in which the Democrat was made to look not competent, and the Republican was made to look competent. And the idea of this was to see whether, when people were studying these flyers, which were identical except for the pairs of pictures, whether the differences in the photos would cause a difference in who they would vote for. And here's the results. When the Republican was put in her competent form against a Democrat that looked less competent, now again, this is not beauty, but competence, the Republican won 58 to 42. But when it was reversed and the Republican was put in a more incompetent looking form, she lost with 44% to 56%. So the vote swing was 14% between the 2 modes of presentation. So this study showed that there seems to be a huge effect of the way someone looks on the electorate. Now, most people, or about in the States, 30 to 40% are diehard Democrats and the same are diehard Republicans, and there's maybe 20% that go one way or the other. So they weren't saying that the diehard Democrats or Republicans were changing their vote, but the people who were undecided were looking at these two sheets of paper and absorbing the person's education, their employment history, their beliefs, their views, and they thought they were making a judgment based on comparing that data. But really, they were also using the data on the person's face and their look, and they were clearly using that to a great extent to decide who to vote for. Now, if you're a skeptic, as I am, and as all scientists are, you would go, ah, that's just in the lab. This surely doesn't happen in the real world. And luckily, a professor at Princeton decided to study how this works in the real world. And so he gathered together, before the 2006 elections, black and white headshots of the competing candidates in dozens of electoral races throughout the country, races for governorships, races for Congress. And he brought a few hundred people into the lab, and he sat them each down and showed them these pairs of photos, one after the other, very quickly, about a half a second on each pair. This is an example of one of the pairs of photos that he showed them. And he told them just to do one thing: look at these photos really quickly and hit this button if the guy on the right looks more competent, and push this button if the guy on the left looks more competent. So it was just a gut reaction. They didn't have time to think. It was just looking at photos after photos after photos. And then he took that data and he did something rather bold. I think he predicted the outcome of hundreds of these races based purely on who looks more competent. So no political polls, no effect of who's the incumbent, didn't look at who advertised more, didn't look at their views, just looked at who looks more competent. And he picked, in every case, the one that his subjects had judged to be more competent as the winner. And the question is, how successful was he? If the look of the person had no effect, he would have gotten about 50% of them right. But he didn't get 50% right, he got 70% right. So in 70% of the races in the United States, the more competent looking candidate won the election. Another way we judge other people is by touch. As these photos illustrate, we are primates like these others, and they engage in grooming behavior, and so do we. And the primates do that, of course, to pick out dirt and bugs from their fur, from their hair, but they also do it to form alliances. They engage in this touching behavior far more minutes per day than they need to for the actual health purposes of it. And in people, touch is much more subtle. We don't go around groping each other and grabbing each other's hair, but touch does have a great effect, and for the most part, we don't even realize it. Let me illustrate that first with a study that was done in France. Now, the idea is that a very subtle touch helps to create a feeling of cooperation and trust amongst people. And neuroscientists have found that it increases certain chemicals in your brain that are related to those feelings. The study in France, they hired two very handsome young Frenchmen to stand on a street corner in a town in northern France on a sunny weekend and proposition as many young single women who walked by as they could. And to each woman they said the same thing, which this is roughly an English translation of that. Hello, my name is Antoine. I think you're really pretty. I have to go to work, but I'd like to get together with you. Will you give me my phone number? And they used the exact same words for every proposition, but there was one difference. To half of the girls that they propositioned, they gave them a light half-second touch on the elbow or the shoulder as they said this, and to the other half they didn't. And the idea was to see, would this affect their success rate? And yes, it did. It doubled it. So they got 10% of the women to give them their phone numbers when they didn't touch them, but 20% when they did. And this same study has been replicated in many other contexts. In the US, we give tips in a restaurant that range between 10 and 20%, but when the waiters in this study were told to just give a light touch at some point during the meal to the diner, they increased their average tips from 14.5% to 17%. Another thing that waiters do is they recommend the special of the day. You know, have the fish with the mustard sauce or whatever. And the question was, would more of the diners take their word that this is a good thing to order if they gave them a light touch than if they didn't? And indeed, it raised it from 40% to 60%. Another study was done in a mall, in a shopping mall. So in the US, it's not uncommon if you're in a shopping mall for someone doing some kind of survey to stop you and ask you if you will spend 5 minutes answering some questions. So in this study, the person who was asking the shoppers to answer questions gave half of them a little touch and half they didn't give a touch, and it increased their success from about half to 3/4 of the people agreed to do it. So this touching, now some people might go, oh my God, I hate to be touched. And of course, these are all averages, but I have to reiterate that these are very subtle touches. And in exit interviews that were done with the subjects afterwards, they generally didn't even remember that they had been touched. So it's really a very subtle way that people communicate with each other. So finally, before I get to the experiments I did on you, I want to talk about something that's not the way that we take in data per se, but the way that we analyze data unconsciously. When we take in the data, we not only have to put it together and fill in the blanks to form a complete picture, but we have to decide what data is reliable versus unreliable, and how much weight to give different data, and how to treat the data more generally on a cognitive level. And the way we do that is through a process that psychologists call motivated reasoning. That means that we don't act like a scientist who takes in the data, examines it all, and attempts to be objective and to draw whatever conclusions are warranted from the data. Instead, we act like an attorney who knows what conclusions he or she wants to come to, and then picks out the data that support that conclusions and tries to impeach the data that doesn't. And that's the general way that people think. And we do it unconsciously. We don't say, I want this to be the answer, whatever issue you're looking at, whether it's you want to look at different cars, or you're trying to buy some real estate, or you're judging somebody, or looking at a political issue, the death penalty, or abortion, or whatever the issue is. You generally have an answer that you want. And as you're looking at the data, you're not saying to yourself, well, I want this to be the answer, and I'm going to judge the data accordingly. You think you're being objective, but you're really not. And let me show you an example of this. This study was done in Texas, and it was they gave the subjects data from a lawsuit. This is a civil lawsuit where someone who was driving a motorcycle crashed into someone who was driving a car and later sued that person. And the judgment, they were told, was somewhere between $0 and $100,000. And they were given the court transcripts and photographs and other evidence from the actual case that occurred in Texas. And they were told to analyze all of this, and that they would later be taking either the role of the plaintiff, that is the motorcycle driver who's asking for the money, or they would be taking the role of the attorney for the car driver and arguing that they shouldn't pay the money. And they would be paired off later and asked to negotiate and see what kind of settlement they could get. So they were given a certain role, and they were told to study all this data and analyze what happened. So they spent some time doing that. And when they were done, before they actually went to negotiate, the researchers said, well, wait a minute, there's one other thing we want you to do. Okay, the real settlement was the real verdict was between $0 and $100,000, and you were supposed to take one side or the other, but now I want you to forget what side you were supposed to take, and I want you to be objective. So set aside your conflict of interest and be objective, and guess what a fair settlement would be. And if you can guess correctly what a fair settlement would be, I'll give you $50. So now they were financially incentivized to forget that they had a role and to forget their conflict of interest and to look back at the data again and to form a picture that's a fair picture rather than an advocate's picture. And the question was, could they do that? And you can probably guess that the answer is no, they couldn't. Because as they were analyzing the data, they were doing it using motivated reasoning. They wanted a certain answer to be the right one. And just like when you heard the backward music, you couldn't stop hearing the words after I showed them to you, they couldn't stop hearing those arguments after they had originally made them. And so when they were asked to guess what would be a fair settlement, the people who had been assigned to represent the motorcyclist who was asking for money guessed on average $40,000 would be fair. And the ones who were told to defend, that they were going to defend against this, and represent the driver, guessed half as much, $20,000. So they were unable to set aside their conflicts of interest. And this happens typically in negotiations, or if you're having a negotiation, you might sometimes wonder, well, how is that other person, you think they're being very unfair? How could they think that? A reasonable person could not think what they're saying. They could not ask for what they're asking for. But if you were in their shoes, there's a good chance you might be thinking that same way. And I feel that, to me, this was a big eye-opener in the political campaigns, because I'll look at someone on the other side and go, surely they don't believe what they're saying. How could they support that candidate? But then if you put yourself in the other person's shoes, you'll see that they judge the same data differently and come to a different picture. And one fun result of this is the image we all have of ourselves. So when we look at data, one thing we want to do is, when we look at data about ourselves, is we want to feel that we're good people, competent people, worthy people. And we look at data and interpret it accordingly using motivated reasoning. So I'll give you just a few examples of that. First, I don't know if any of you have teenagers at home. This is a study of high school students in the US. They studied 3 million, these are education researchers. They studied 3 million high school students and gave them dozens of questions to answer on a survey. And one of the questions was a fun one: are you above average? So if you have teenagers at home, you'll know that the answer is probably yes. And so in this 3 million group, to the precision that I'm going to quote, 3 significant figures we would say in physics, 100% of them said that they were above average. So rare was the high school student who said that he or she was below average. Now the professors, turns out, aren't really any better. Now professors should know that half of the professors' research as a whole is below average by definition, and only room for half of them to be above average. But when professors were asked the question, is your research below average or above average, 94% said their own research was above average. Doctors suffer from the same malady, and in medicine this translates into overconfidence. When you ask a doctor, how confident are you about a diagnosis, they tend to be overconfident. In this study, doctors were asked about something that they tended to diagnose as pneumonia, and they were asked, what's your degree of confidence in your diagnosis? And the average answer was 88%. I'm 88% sure that this is the right diagnosis. And in this study, they were only right 20% of the time, but they were sure 88% of the time. It happens also in business where CEOs tend to look at another company that they want to purchase and think that they can run it better than the other person could. And as a result of this overconfidence, they tend to overpay for acquisitions. And finally, I want to show you an example from memory, because we're going to get back to memory, which I tested yours earlier. And memory is a big player in this motivated reasoning game. One of the ways that we get to the result that we want to get to is selective memory. And in this study, college students who were graduating were asked about their grades 4 years earlier in high school. And they had signed away permission for the research to have their actual transcripts. So they knew that the researchers had their transcripts. There was no point in lying or misrepresenting the grades that they got. But they asked them about how many, in the States we get A, B, C, D, and F. So A is the highest, it's like number 1, I guess. And then B is the next highest, C. And what they found was that the memory for A's was very good, and not quite so good for B's, and so on, and very bad for the lower grades. It was 89% for A's, all the way down to 29% for D's, which as a teacher, I think is a good lesson, because it shows you that if you don't like your grades, just wait a few years and they'll get better. So this is how motivated reasoning affects our perception of ourselves. Now, I've given you a few ways that what we would call in psychology cognitive illusions. These are like optical illusions, but they're illusions in our judgment, in our social judgment. But you might be thinking, well, and in fact there are studies that show this, people tend to go to accept this when they read it, but think it doesn't apply to me. So in other studies in which psychologists talk about these effects, and then they give people a questionnaire later, they find that they tend to believe this, but not about themselves. So let's look at you now. Before the talk, I divided you into 2 groups, and I asked you 2 questions, and the second question was, how much would you expect to pay for this hotel room? And here's the answers. Thank you. So, well, let me show you how some other groups have answered. I've given this to many groups, but I put on, I guess, about 10 of them here. And these were in dollars, so you have to translate. But or some of them were in pounds, but I converted them to dollars. So Group 1 tended to answer rather high. Let's see, you guys were Group 1. And Group 2 tended to answer rather much lower. Okay, so let me tell you what you guys did. Group 1 averaged 819 euros, rather high, compared to Group 2, who averaged 250 euros. So I used some subliminal magic without even coming down off stage, and I manipulated you in a certain way. And what's interesting is that you're a very sophisticated audience, and you've probably heard of something called anchoring. And this is what was going on, because the difference between group 1 and group 2 was the first question that you looked at, where I said to the first group, does this hotel room cost more than 4,500 euros a night? And to the second group, 45. And 4,500, by the way, the actual room was about 450. So I just multiplied by 10 for the group 1, and I divided by 10 for group 2. So it was kind of like wild numbers that I gave you, and I figured you'd probably go, that's absurd. Of course, it's not more than 4,500, and it's more than 45. And even though it seems like a throwaway question, it had this huge effect on your evaluation, a factor of 3. So it does affect you, at least on average. And the other experiment we did had to do with memory. And I gave you this list, and I asked you whether these words were on the list. So as you can see, the word point is not on the list, and I only had 2 people said that point was on the list, and that's just random noise, and that happens. People mistakenly remember something. But the other 2 words were taste and sweet. Now, remember where I said only if you're confident and you can actually remember me saying the word, you can picture the word. So I hope you follow that. And let's see, the word taste was on the list, and 36 people correctly remembered that. The question is, would you have a false memory? How many people had a false memory of the word sweet? And the answer is, even though 36 correctly remembered taste, 45 had a false memory of the word sweet. So the reason is that your unconscious mind, when you think back and you remember things, you may also notice, just like I said, you might wonder why someone on the other who supports the other party could look at the world and have that view. Sometimes you may remember that you were discussing with a friend or your spouse or your kids something that happened in the past, and you can't figure out how they could remember something so differently than you. And the answer is memories are not recorded in your brain like a video camera does. The memories in your brain are just like your vision. Remember the first picture I showed you? They have certain key things recorded there, and your mind fills in the rest. And it fills in the rest using things that you know, like context, but also other things like your beliefs or your desires. So it's a biased memory. In this case, though, it was context that was at work. And if you look at the list, what your brain remembered was a lot of sweet things. Even if you didn't consciously say to yourself, oh, a lot of these words are sweet, your unconscious recorded that. And when you reconstructed the memory in your brain and gave you what you thought was a clear memory of me saying the word or of you picturing the word, you got the wrong answer. And if any of you are attorneys, in my book I write a lot about the effects of this in the legal system, because we give far too much credence to eyewitnesses than we ought to. And there's horrible cases, at least in the US, where there's very little physical evidence against somebody, but there's an eyewitness. And what happens in eyewitnesses is you fill in when you look at faces, just like you fill in your memories here, and you think sweet was on the list. So if the police show you a bunch of faces and say one of these guys is the culprit, pick out which one. If you agree, that if you recognize that person, the context is that the police have found a suspect, and you tend to believe that. And if one of the faces, if the real person is not on in this group of photographs, but someone who resembles the person is, you'll fill in the details, and you can actually change it'll change your memory of the person, and you can actually remember and be quite certain that that is the culprit, even when it isn't. And thanks to DNA testing, now there are hundreds of examples of this in the US where people were convicted based on very thin evidence and eyewitness alone, and then it was later shown through DNA testing this was a false identification. And in one very dramatic case, after the person who had was accused of committing a rape had been identified by the victim, who had actually studied his face very carefully. He had been identified by her in a trial and convicted. In prison, another person who was in prison confessed to the rape. This was told to the authorities, and there was a new trial. And at the new trial, they had both the person who had confessed and the person who was originally identified. And the victim, again, picked out the same person that she picked out the first time. And he was sent back to prison with an even longer sentence this time. And he was in prison another 10 years before DNA evidence came out, and he was exonerated, and it was indeed the person who had confessed who did it. But the eyewitness, after seeing all these police lineups, was convinced that it was the person she had picked because her mind had filled in the details, and every time that she was shown these photos again, she became more and more confident of her identification. So let me end with a quote by Carl Jung that summarizes this. These subliminal aspects of everything that happens to us may seem to play very little part in our daily lives, but they are the almost invisible roots of our conscious thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So it was anonymous, wasn't it, the test? So we're not going through the rows and see. What you said in the end was very interesting to me, because one of the other fields that neurosciences are under a legal aspect may be problematic is the question of guilt. Guilt, free will,
right.
Responsibility. You were talking about witnesses, and that they remembered always the same false way. If that field is very close to the field of the question of a free will, and what is going on in our brain if we are doing things willingly or not, and what does this mean to responsibility and to guilt in a legal sense. What is the difference? Where would you see the difference?
Well, I wish I could say the difference is X, but it's not physics, unfortunately. So people are discussing that and writing books and papers about it, and it's something that society has to decide. But as we study the brain, we see more and more how your behavior is connected to stuff that's going on in your brain. There's a physical brain there, and what you do is a combination of your past experiences and the physical structure of your brain. So it's a question that everyone has to answer for himself or herself. If someone is raised, let's say, beaten as a child and grows up to beat their own kids, we can see clearly, and we could have seen this many decades ago, that will tend to cause the person, the experience as a child will cause a person to behave that way as an adult. So morally, how much blame do you give the person? That's what people have to decide. But now we can also see that certain aspects of the way your brain is structured can also cause you to behave in certain ways. And we have to, in the same way, decide whether we're going to blame the person's brain, or whether we even want to talk about blame. Because in my view, when you talk about crime and punishment, it's all about the desired effect on society. So when you punish someone, it's not, to me, it shouldn't be to blame them or to make them suffer, or even to change them in particular, because studies show that's very difficult. It's to protect society from them is the reason you incarcerate someone or punish them. But society has to decide why we're going to put people...
In that respect, it wouldn't even matter whether it was his free will or not.
Right, it wouldn't matter. And there was one very interesting and sad case, for instance, where someone who had been perfectly normal all his life suddenly got into child pornography and started abusing his kid. And it was then discovered that he had a brain tumor in a certain part of his brain, and it was removed, and he went back to being totally normal. And then some years later, this other behavior started again, and they found that the brain tumor had come back. And so there's a pretty clear connection there in that person. That's a very extreme example. But so society has to look at these cases, and as we're learning more and more about the human being as a biological machine, we have to decide how we're going to want to judge them.
And then it was another thing that I found interesting. You pointed out that it was a question of competence, those photographs of the candidates, and not of beauty. Are you sure that people would make that difference? Because it was interesting, on the other hand, because it somehow could lead us back to the classical philosophy in Greece, where Plato and his colleagues, of course, were convinced that beauty and truth beauty and truth were the same, in fact. So why do we make this distinction between competence and beauty now?
Well, what the researchers were doing, were trying to see a correlation between competence and electability, or competence in people's judgments. Now, there may or may not be a connection between people's judgment of beauty and who they vote for, but these scientists decided to study the look of competence because it seemed more relevant to the decision. Beauty has not, as far as I know, been studied in elections, but it's been studied in other things, and they found that, for instance, in job interviews, people who look better who look more beautiful tend to be favored. Whether it's true in elections, I don't know. And also, I would imagine there's an overlap between the look of competence and the look of beauty. But it's not that they're saying that beauty doesn't affect how you vote. It's just that these studies focused on how the look of competence affects how you vote.
Yeah. And a third thing was interesting because we heard a lot of the, you talk about repeated actions or repeated behavior that we don't have control of because it's in our minds and construction of our minds. And there are some or not, or many of the new technologies that we were talking about before, the internet, all those driving forces of, let's say, changes in our society. Many people are afraid of producing fears, angst, German angst, and maybe also addiction. So that the repeated behavior that you at some moment in time do not have control over anymore. Is this a phenomenon that is close to what you told us? What does addiction play? What was the role of addiction in that set of facts that you somehow
Well, what I was focusing on is how we perceive the world, the social world and the physical world. So it's not directly related to addictions, but addictions, people study addictions and they find that they are related to chemical balances or imbalances in the brain. So it's not necessarily something that you can control, but it's not something that people study when they talk about, usually when they talk about the unconscious mind. So that's more how we make decisions and interact with people and the thoughts that we have about our social world and our physical perception.
So it doesn't have to do anything, the one with the other, because it's a complete separated region in the brain physiologically, or is it?
Well, the brain isn't divided usually so starkly between one region does this and one region does that. There's usually many regions that contribute, but the addictions are connected to certain chemical imbalances in certain parts of the brain that are not the parts of the brain that are what you use for vision or for social judgment.
And the last question, since we're talking here with quite a big number of business people, are there any things that you would draw as recommendations for business people from that knowledge, from the sort of knowledge that you present?
Well, I think there's a lot that you can certainly directly draw that the anchoring, which you probably most people have heard of, but maybe now you can see how real it is even for yourselves. That in negotiations, that's very important. But also always understanding that when you're making a judgment, you have to be careful because some cases you really want to make an objective judgment for yourself. Let's say it's a financial judgment, but you are being kind of insidiously influenced by other things. And it's what you can do with your conscious mind is step back, try and become aware of that, try and force yourself to being more objective or get either other people's advice or take another look at the data to make sure that you're not being unduly influenced by other things that you're not aware of. So it's really important in business to keep that in mind.
The most important thing seems to be that to get second opinions because you might not be able yourself to just rethink
right, or to find, if you can find objective ways of looking at the data, maybe before you look at a particular analysis that you're making, a specific analysis, you start out with certain rules that you're going to do the analysis by, and then you follow them without changing them in order to make it come out the way you might unconsciously want. But remember, you won't know that you're changing them for that reason. It'll just seem like what you should do. So you have to try and remove yourself as possible. And also to have more understanding for the people that you're negotiating with because they're seeing things from their point of view.
Okay, thanks again very much for this really
Thank you.
great presentation.